This water was too corrosive for car parts, but families in Flint, Michigan were still told it was safe enough to drink. That is the sentence that should stop you. Not because it is the whole story, but because it reveals the whole system. In 2014, brown water, cloudy water, water that smelled wrong and tasted metallic began coming out of kitchen taps in one of America's most important industrial cities. Not in a failed state, not in a distant country, in the United States, in the birthplace of General Motors. For about 18 months, nearly 100,000 people were exposed after Flint switched its drinking water source from Detroit's system to the Flint River. Children drank it. Parents cooked with it. Babies bathed in it. Families mixed formula with it. And for far too long, they were told the water was safe. But Flint's story is not just a story about contaminated water. It is the story of what happens after an empire leaves. First the factories go, then the tax base collapses, then local democracy gets narrowed, then maintenance becomes optional, then one day, the water itself becomes a threat. This is Flint, Michigan, Vehicle City, a place that helped put America on wheels, a city where the American dream was not imagined in speeches, but assembled on a moving line. To understand why Flint's betrayal cuts so deep, you have to understand what Flint once was. In 1908, William C. Durant created General Motors in Flint. This was not just a city with a GM plant. This was one of the cradles of the modern automobile empire. Buick was here. Chevrolet was tied to this world. AC Sparkplug Fisher Body and an entire web of suppliers, factories, tool shops, and assembly lines grew out of this place. Flint did not simply host the auto industry. Flint became one of the rooms where industrial America learned how to breathe. By the middle of the 20th century, Flint was one of the great manufacturing cities in the country. At its peak in 1960, it had nearly 200,000 residents. During the boom years, General Motors employed tens of thousands of people across the Flint area, often described as more than 80,000 by the late 1970s. That number was not just employment. It was houses, grocery stores, schools, churches, union halls, diner booths after the second shift, cars and driveways built by the same hands that drove them home. An assembly line worker without a college degree could buy a house, raise a family, send children to school, and retire with a pension. Flint was not just making cars. It was manufacturing the social contract of 20th century America. Work hard, organize, produce, and the machine will give something back. Flint proved that contract could be real. In 1936 and 1937, workers occupied General Motors plants during the Flint sit-down strike, one of the most important labor battles in American history. They did not simply march outside the gates. They held the factories from within, taking control of the production lines themselves. When the strike ended, GM recognized the United Auto Workers, and a weak union on the edge of the industry became a force powerful enough to reshape American labor. That is why Flint matters. It did not just give America cars. It helped give America the union power that protected millions of workers from being consumed by the very factories they served. Vehicle City believed the machine would run forever. It was wrong. The flaw was hidden inside the triumph. Flint was built around one industrial empire. When that empire needed workers, Flint became rich. When that empire no longer needed Flint the same way, the city had very few defenses. Starting in the late 1970s, General Motors began cutting. Automation reduced labor needs. Plants closed, production moved to other states, other countries, and lower-cost systems. Corporate restructuring turned Flint from a city built around industrial concentration into a city built around industrial loss. More than 80,000 Flint area residents worked for GM in 1978. By 1990, that number had fallen to roughly 23,000. By the 2000s, it was around 8,000. In 1999, Buick City, the massive manufacturing complex that once symbolized Flint's industrial power, shut down completely. A place that had looked permanent became empty acreage, broken concrete, and memory. When the jobs left, the tax base followed. When the tax base shrank, city services weakened. When services weakened, people with options left. Flint's population fell from nearly 200,000 to around 80,000. Poverty rose. Houses emptied. Schools struggled. Blocks built for auto workers became patchworks of occupied homes, vacant lots, and buildings the city could no longer afford to save. This was already a tragedy, but it was not yet the Flint water crisis. That came later, after the city had already been weakened enough that life-changing decisions could be made over the heads of the people who lived there. By 2011, Flint was under emergency management by the state of Michigan. local democracy had been narrowed by financial emergency. The city was no longer being governed like a community with a future. It was being managed like a cost problem. That detail is not background. It is the hinge of the story, because once a city is treated like a spreadsheet, every human need becomes a line item. Streets become line items, schools become line items, pipes become line items, water becomes a line item. On April 25, 2014, while Flint waited for a new regional pipeline, officials switched the city's drinking water source from Detroit's system to the Flint River. The move was framed as a way to save money, with projected savings often reported around $5 million over 2 years. But the Flint River water was more corrosive than the treated water Flint had been receiving before. And the system did not properly use corrosion control. That failure mattered because Flint had aging pipes and lead service lines. Without proper corrosion control, the water began eating into the city's old plumbing. Lead started leaching into the drinking water of nearly 100,000 people. The bitterest detail is how small the missing protection was. Reports later described corrosion control as costing roughly $80 to $100 a day. Not millions, not billions, $100 a day. Less than the price of a hotel room. Less than a dinner for a small table in Washington. And because that protection was not used, Flint became a national warning about what happens when cost-cutting replaces care. The warnings came early. Residents complained almost immediately. The water was brown. It smelled bad. It caused rashes. It tasted wrong. It damaged trust before officials were willing to admit it damaged bodies. One Flint mother, Leanne Walters, refused to accept the official answers. Her family's water showed alarming lead levels. Her children had been exposed. When local institutions failed her, she reached out to outside experts. That is one of the most important parts of Flint. The crisis was not exposed because the system worked. It was exposed because residents refused to be quiet. In October 2014, only months after the switch, General Motors discovered that Flint water was corroding engine parts at one of its plants. GM was allowed to switch that plant away from the Flint River source. Stop and sit with that. The water was too corrosive for car parts. But the people of Flint, men, women, and children, continued to be reassured that the water was safe. For roughly another year, the city stayed on the Flint River source. The cars were protected before the children were. By 2015, the evidence was no longer just complaints. It was in household water samples. It was in bottles residents carried into public meetings. It was in the warnings of EPA water expert Miguel del Toral. It was in the testing work of Virginia Tech researchers. And finally, it was in the blood of Flint's children. Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, a pediatrician in Flint, studied blood lead levels in children and found that the percentage of children with elevated lead in their blood had risen after the water switch. When she made the findings public, officials initially pushed back. But the data was real, the children were real, the lead was real, and lead is not an ordinary contaminant. There is no known safe level of blood lead for children. It can damage brain development, attention, behavior, learning, and long-term health. It does not have to kill quickly to change the course of a life. It can work quietly, invisibly, inside a child's body, long after the cameras leave. Flint's water crisis was not only about chemistry, it was about power. Who gets believed? Who gets dismissed? Who has to prove that the water in their own home is poisoning them? Who gets an emergency response and who gets told to relax? In October 2015, Flint switched back to Detroit water. By then, the city had spent about 18 months on the Flint River source. But switching back did not undo what had happened. Pipes had been damaged. Children had been exposed. Families had already spent months drinking, cooking, bathing, and mixing baby formula with water they were told was safe. Later came lawsuits, investigations, resignations, settlements, outrage, and years of pipe replacement. Michigan eventually completed the replacement of nearly 11,000 lead water pipes in Flint, a real and important milestone. But pipes are easier to replace than trust. Today, many Flint residents still hesitate before drinking from the tap. That hesitation is not paranoia, it is memory. Flint is still standing. Around 80,000 people live there. Roughly a third of the city lives below the poverty line. Thousands of houses sit abandoned or vacant. Buick City no longer roars. The old auto empire is mostly gone. But Flint is not empty, and calling it dead would erase the people who stayed, organized, tested water, confronted officials, raised children, and forced the country to look at what had been done. Every city in this series declines in its own way. Ghost towns die when the gold runs out. Steel towns die when the furnaces go cold. Resort cities die when people stop coming. Flint suffered something crueler. It was first abandoned by the industrial empire that built it, then poisoned through the most basic promise a city makes to its people. Water is the first promise of civilization. Before highways, before stadiums, before factories, before tax incentives, before political speeches, a city must be able to say one thing: you can drink here and live. Flint could not say that. This city made America rich. It helped give birth to General Motors. It helped give birth to the union that protected millions of workers. It assembled the American dream, one car at a time. And after the empire left, the final reward it received was lead in the water and a lie that lasted far too long. The question is not simply why Flint collapsed. The frightening question is what made Flint vulnerable enough for this to happen in the first place, because infrastructure does not fail all at once. First, the empire leaves. Then, the tax base shrinks. Then, accountability weakens. Then, maintenance becomes negotiable. Then, one day, a parent turns on the kitchen tap and realizes the collapse has entered the glass. If it could happen in the birthplace of General Motors, in a city that helped build modern America, what protects the place where you live? If you want to follow the places where glory goes to die, subscribe. Next week, a steel city once so powerful it lost 5,000 jobs in a single day. They called it Black Monday.